Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. Sorry this one is a little bit late, but I had to wait a bit for the challenger buffs to expire with the timeline reset so that I could properly test Deadpool's new uniform in PvP. The aesthetics of this uniform are kind of weird. I don't think many of us were expecting a Gwenpool uniform for Deadpool, and I'm pretty sure that myself and other people would prefer a more iconic look of his red and black kind of themed uniform, but I guess this is what we get, so it is what it is. With the aesthetics aside, what people really want to know about the uniform is whether it's better than the previous uniforms and how much better it is and how it performs in both PvE and PvP. I obviously had to be pretty thorough in my testing, considering that this uniform is the undiscounted price, which is the 1,750 crystals. So as a quick spoiler, the uniform is definitely better in PvE and is also better in PvP in a specific way, but the way that the uniform is better in both modes might not necessarily be of interest to you. So in order for me to show you how much better the new uniform is, I need to first show you how the old uniform compares so that you get a frame of reference. Keep in mind that all my testing is done without a damage proc. I simply have a reforged CTP of regen with the penetration proc effect. With the old uniform, I can't even finish a stage 99 of Thanos, and it takes me about 2 minutes and 20 seconds for me to complete his first phase. Because Deadpool has such high all defense down that ignores immunity, completing stage 99 of Proxima on the other hand isn't really that difficult, and I finished that with about 3 minutes and 15 seconds remaining roughly. If you happen to check Deadpool's newest uniform and are wondering what is different between this one and the old one, most notably he gets 10% increased HP, he gets 10% chain hit damage which he didn't have before, and his leadership now applies to all allies with an additional 5% damage that it didn't have before since it was 35 and now it's 40. And on top of that, Gwenpool also gets an additional 60% increased damage versus bosses that only applies to her. In terms of his skill changes, the 4th skill used to hit up to 26 times, and with the new uniform that goes up to 36 times or 10 additional hits. In addition to that, the skill can now be insta-cancelled, meaning you can layer the damage on to the rest of your rotation. The previous 5th skill hit up to 29 times. Even though the animation was pretty great, it was kind of long and couldn't really be cancelled. With the new 5th skill, it hits up to 35 times, so 6 more hits, and is a full iframe for the beginning part of the skill, and can also be cancelled. Aside from these differences and changes, the one that is most important is the fact that his 3rd skill now has damage accumulation for damage dealt. The 3rd skill actually does some pretty good damage, but because it has the damage accumulation on it and the duration of the skill is kind of quick, you'll likely want to use it right away to get the accumulation started and then layer on the 5th and 4th while proccing on a skill that has a longer animation so you make the most of that proc. If you're building him specifically for PvE, I can't really say whether a rage, destruction, or energy would be better, since he doesn't have that guaranteed crit rate that synergizes well with the CTP of rage effect, and because his 5th skill does have some initial hits on it, it might mess up the single skill proc on something like the ultimate or the 2nd skill. You can already see the difference that the new uniform makes, since at the 2 minute and 38 second mark I was able to get Thanos down 6 health bars more than the previous uniform, and I was actually able to complete this fight, whereas with the old one I definitely would not be able to with the time that was left. Since you can cancel a lot of his skills now, the rotation that you might want to try out is use the 3rd skill and cancel it into the 5th skill, which you delay cancel after he throws the bag of weapons down, into the 4th skill, which then you cancel into the 2nd skill. The reason for doing the skills in this order is because the 3rd gives you that damage accumulation, the 5th gives you a damage buff, the 4th is a damage layer, and the 2nd skill is a semi-long animation that you would want to proc on with all the other damage skills going on. With the new uniform, I'm able to complete the same stage of Proxima about 45 seconds faster than before. Now, testing in World Boss Ultimate is fine and all, but if you really want to see the difference in damage between uniforms, you have to take the character into World Boss Legend. Again, in order to get a better understanding of how much better the new uniform is, I had to compare it with the old uniform, and I actually went one step further and also tested out the Lady Deadpool uniform, which is traditionally known as being the better one in terms of PvE. With the old uniform, I make it to the halfway mark with 2 minutes and 14 seconds left. With the Holiday Lady Deadpool uniform, I finished about 20 seconds faster than the 30th anniversary or the kind of mobster uniform. And then finally, using the latest uniform, I'm a minute ahead of the Lady Deadpool uniform, or a minute and 20 seconds ahead of the 30th anniversary uniform. By the way, if you were wondering what the rotation is once you have the T3 unlocked, you basically just substitute out the second skill for the sixth skill. So you would do 3 cancel, 5 delay cancel, 4 cancel, and then your ultimate skill. Because I can now complete the first phase of Knull with the new uniform under the 3-minute mark, that means that I can actually complete the entire fight with the new uniform, as opposed to not being able to do so with any of Deadpool's previous uniforms. Unfortunately, that's not really saying much since I finished with 47 seconds left, and that's not really that great considering that my build is a top 51, including Odin's on it. Considering the cost of the uniform, I kind of think that it needs to be buffed and do better, but at the same time I'm hesitant to say that since I would kind of prefer that a more iconic or classic looking uniform be the one that is his primary one going forward. If there's anything that really needs to be adjusted with this uniform or the next iteration, it has to be the ultimate skill. It hasn't been changed in any of the uniforms, and the number of hits and damage on the skill is quite outdated compared to the current standard of ultimate skills, and it basically hits like a 5th skill or even a 4th skill. I wasn't able to take him into higher stages of Knull due to the stage restrictions, so instead I took him into a stage 19 of Mephisto to see how he would do there. Funny enough, I was actually able to complete the stage, but I finished with exactly 0 seconds left on the clock. Keep in mind that I'm only using one support because I don't have access to any other supports available with these stage restrictions. So technically he should be able to do a little bit better once that is available, but even with that he should be able to finish about 30 seconds faster, and if you watched my Hawkeye video you would know that Hawkeye was able to complete stage 24 of Mephisto with 30 seconds remaining. So even though Deadpool is a native tier 2 character with an expensive, non-discounted uniform, he still performs worse than basically a free-to-play character with a discounted uniform. Despite this uniform upgrade, Deadpool is still lacking in the PvE department, and to give you a better idea of that, I took him into ABX. Even though I have an Odin stack build on Deadpool, I was still able to score only in the 7.6 million range, which for a character that is built this well, should easily be able to score past the 8 million mark. Just as a frame of reference, for characters like Kingpin, Hawkeye, and Kate Bishop, which I don't have any Odins on, and I don't have a damage proc on, I was able to easily score in the 8.2 million range with them. Now you might be thinking, if the new uniform doesn't make him a powerhouse in PvE, maybe it's meant to be a big upgrade in PvP. And if you were to think that, then no, it kind of doesn't, but it does make him better. Initially I thought that the old uniform was better than the new one because the iframe on the 4th skill was a lot longer than the new one, which is basically just an iframe for the first second or so. However, I noticed that versus tankier characters or ones that do more burst damage, the new uniform is much more consistent because it itself does more burst damage too. Again, at first I thought this wasn't the case because the AI doesn't really use the 3rd skill, and all of the damage accumulation and increased damage is mostly focused on that skill. but because the 5th and 4th skill can be cancelled, if at any point the opponent interrupts Deadpool while he casts these skills, he'll basically just have them be cancelled on top of one another, which allows him to essentially one-shot opponents with any other skill that he casts from there on. Another reason why the uniform tends to perform better is because the 5th skill animation is less than half the time of the previous one, meaning that the damage will come out much quicker, and besides that, the cooldown is about 3 seconds less than the previous one, meaning that it will be up or is available more often. To add to this, the 3rd skill also has a higher cooldown now, meaning that it will generate more parts of the ultimate meter, so if the character survives long enough, they should be able to enter the ultimate much more often. In terms of the build recommendation, I would still lean towards the defensive side more for Deadpool, especially now that he can fill up his ultimate a bit faster, and because he can layer multiple skills on top of one another, he'll have a lot of skills out on the arena and be able to one-shot you from all of them stacking up. That said, a CTP of Greed might be pretty good with multiple skills being procced on, but at the same time you might not really need it since his damage seems to be good enough without the need of a proc to take down pretty tanky characters, even ones like Thanos. Between Authority and Regen, I would lean towards Regen, especially now that he has more HP from his uniform passive. Even though the character is better in PvP versus tanky or burst characters, the question still remains of whether the upgrade is worth it. In order to try and answer that, I fought the same teams, but this time using the old uniform. The AI rotation is largely the same. The character prioritizes the 5th and 4th skill first, and then usually uses the 1st skill for the iframe ignore, with the 3rd skill usually being the one that's left out of the AI rotation. The thing that's interesting about this is that the 3rd skill with the old uniform provides Deadpool with super armor and a defense increase. So because the 3rd skill doesn't activate that frequently, he doesn't really get the benefit of this. However, with the new uniform, that buff has now been moved to the 5th skill, which he uses much more actively, and this is really noticeable versus characters that have super guard break, because that super armor and the guard break immunity that he has from something like a CTP kind of combine to give him immunity versus super guard break in a sense. The defense buff also makes him a little bit tankier, but the super armor buff is really what's the most noticeable. You'll see that in these clips, he kind of tends to get head rocked more often from that super guard break, whereas in the previous clips with the new uniform, that doesn't really seem to be the case. This makes a pretty big difference because with this old uniform, if he gets interrupted on his 5th or 4th skill, all of that damage basically goes to waste, and he pretty much just ends up using the 2nd, 1st, or possibly the 3rd skill to do damage. But with the new uniform, he can just jump from the 5th skill and the 4th skill being layered on into any of the other skills, the 1, 2, and 3 that I mentioned, adding a considerable amount of damage. You'll notice that with the new uniform, I was able to ace all of these fights, whereas with the old one, I am struggling a little bit, mostly due to the fact that he gets cancelled out of his 5th and 4th skill, and those are primarily the ones that deal the most damage, and the ones that are going to take out the opponents. You'll see that the fights tend to last longer because of this, and he does seem to struggle versus opponents that have burst damage or that have the potential to do a lot of damage at one time, usually because they can start stacking up buffs or layer damage on top of one another like Deadpool's new uniform can. As a result of this is why he struggles versus characters like Thanos, because while he is doing his 5th or 4th skill, Thanos can potentially just go into his 4th skill alone and take out Deadpool in one go. You can see an example of that here with Doom using 5 and 4 to finish off Deadpool. I actually had to speed up this last clip because he took so long with his old uniform. So you have to keep in mind that if you decide to take the character into Alliance Conquest with this previous uniform, he probably will lose versus the top metas anyway because he doesn't really have the damage to take them out. But versus the lower ones, he shouldn't really have a problem because his healing should allow him to be ahead of their health bars when the timeout hits. This is another reason why the new uniform might be better for Alliance Conquest as well, because his best defense with it is that he has much higher offense. To prove what I'm talking about, here is me playing the character on manual, and if you want to play him on manual, you basically just spam his 5 and 4 as well as his 3rd when it's off cooldown, and when the opponent is in iframe at any point, you just spam the first skill. So it's basically just a lot of skill spamming. But because those skills can stack on top of one another, you can see just how quick it can take out opponents. I was able to take out Thanos in 1 second, and even versus Warlock, I could do the same. The best part is that once you've cast the 5 and 4 skills, you basically just go into the first skill, which is the iframe ignore, and knock the opponent out of their iframe into all the damage that you've laid out on the map. So you can see that the character is better in PvE and is more consistent and arguably better in PvP. I haven't done Alliance Conquest yet, so I can't fully verify that, but considering the results that I got from Timeline, I expect similar ones in Alliance Conquest as well. Despite the fact that he is better, I wouldn't necessarily recommend this uniform to most people because of its cost. There are other characters with a lower cost that can do just what Deadpool does and even better, and you could largely see that he was able to take out the same teams with the old uniform, even though it did take a bit longer and was slightly less consistent. Also, with the new uniform, his PvE performance isn't really anything special, and I would argue is a little bit below average considering the cost of the uniform and the fact that Deadpool is still a native tier 2 character. With that in mind, I'm actually a little bit disappointed that his artifact didn't give him that immortal passive like Wolverine, since they are so similar to one another. On top of that, there's so many good speed types now in PvP that Deadpool doesn't really stand out compared to them. He basically just has his healing, but even that can be overcome by the high burst damage from strong metas like you saw in the timeline clips. This isn't to say that his artifact isn't good, since with the new uniform and the leadership, you can kind of combine it to get kind of a debuff removal on the character and the benefits of his own leadership, but it is really unfortunate that he didn't get that immortal passive to be able to stand out as a unique speed type in PvP, kind of similar to how Spider-Man does, especially considering the fact that the artifact is called Undying, and he doesn't get an undying effect. Considering that the anniversary is just around the corner, and that this uniform doesn't really let you do something that you couldn't with the previous ones, I would say probably skip this uniform, especially considering the fact that you could get 2 really great ones for the same cost. That pretty much does it for this video. This was kind of a weird April Fool's, since I guess it did live up to its name. It didn't really provide us with the kind of update that we wanted for Deadpool, so I guess it was kind of a joke. But yeah, anyways, that does it for this one. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking, subscribing, and possibly sharing the video. If you have any questions, leave it in the comments section, or consider joining the Discord, which you can find a link in the video description. As always, thank you for your time and watching, but the video is now over.